on our YouTube, on the Philip Merrill College of Journalism YouTube channel. And with that, we are going to go ahead over here and get started. So, good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome all of you to Standing Up for Press Freedom. Merrill alumni, Pentagon reporters share their stories. My name is Eugene Oba. I am the co-founder and vice president of Common Sense Entertainment, an independent multimedia production company based in DC. I also have graduated from the Philip Merrill College of Journalism in May 2011. So for a lot of you, I've been in your shoes. I also am a member of the board of the Journalism Alumni Network here on this campus, which is bringing you this event along with the Society of Professional Journalists, who are co-sponsoring this event. So a huge, huge thanks to them for doing this. And when we decided to do this, I think about the relationship between the press and the government, whether it's local or national or municipal, whatever the case may be. And it can be very fruitful in a lot of it, but at times this can also be a little adversarial, and probably, arguably, none more so than what has been happening now with the current administration, and especially with the Department of Defense under Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. So we have assembled an incredible group of journalists who have been impacted by the new rules of the Defense Department, in that really it's like if you don't report what they're telling you, then it's like basically get out of the sandbox, okay? And a lot of these journalism organizations have decided we're not going to play by those rules. So again, we've assembled a great group of people, and I want people hopefully to understand how these guys have been impacted through varying degrees by the new rules, and how this impacts journalism, journalists, and the public in terms of their right to know what's going on in their government. So joining us here tonight to help us answer a lot of these questions are Jamie McIntyre, the Washington Examiner, Idrees Ali of Thomson Reuters, Dan Lamothe of the Washington Post, and Olivia Logan, the Department of Defense Communications Specialist, and moderating our panel this evening, Lucy Dalglish, Professor and Dean Emerita of the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. Folks, welcome to this panel. It is so great to have you on. I just want to say on behalf of our Journalism Alumni Network board, it is really, really gratifying to have all of you here. And before we get to the questions and toss it over to Lucy over here, I do want to remind all of you that we do have a Q&A session. We will have a Q&A session towards the end. Submit your questions, please, in the chat, and we will go through them and be able to answer as many as we possibly can. But we do have a lot of you that are attending this evening, so if you can stick to perhaps maybe one question, maybe if you've got 5 questions, maybe pick the best one, that will be great. And then I also want to disclaim here that the information, the opinions that are presented here tonight are of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Defense, the Department of War, or any of the organizations that anybody is affiliated with. So I just want to make sure that we get that out there. And with that, I hand the rest of this program to Lucy.
Thank you, Eugene. It's wonderful to see that the Merrill Alumni Network is thriving. Got started about 5 years ago, and it's just growing and growing. It's wonderful to see that. You'll note that from your media law classes, right, that Maryland is a two-party state. So that's among the reasons why we have to tell you that we are being recorded. Several of our distinguished alums have incredible experience covering military affairs, and one who has worked for more than a decade as a contractor doing public affairs work for the Navy is joining us tonight. In alphabetical order, we have Idrees Ali, who is a national security reporter covering the Pentagon for Reuters. Idrees has reported on military activities and operations in more than 24 countries, including Iraq, Afghanistan, and much of the Middle East, Asia, and Europe since he graduated with a master's degree in journalism from Merrill College in 2015. He arrived shortly after I did at Merrill College, and it has truly been a joy to watch his success. He's originally from Karachi, Pakistan, where several of his family members are also distinguished journalists. Dan Lamothe, who covers the U.S. military and Pentagon for the Washington Post, also has a master's degree in journalism from Merrill College. He's a Massachusetts native who first wrote for a professional newspaper while he was in high school. Since graduating from Merrill in 2008, he has worked for the Marine Corps Times and Foreign Policy magazine before going to work for the Post in 2014. He has spent months at a time embedded with troops in Afghanistan, and he's reported from more than 30 countries for the Post. In 2023, his work covering the U.S. evacuation from Afghanistan was recognized with the Gerald R. Ford Prize for Distinguished Reporting on National Defense. He is the recipient of 4 Marine Corps Heritage Foundation Awards. Olivia Logan graduated with a bachelor's degree in journalism from Merrill College in 2008. She is an accredited communications professional with 15 years of public affairs and strategic communications experience supporting Department of Defense clients, specifically the Naval Sea Systems Command, the Office of Chief of Naval Operations, and the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. Early in her career, she worked as a journalist and now mostly works as a contractor supporting the communication needs of the military. I will let her further describe her job. Olivia is the vice president or vice chair, I don't know what we're calling them, of the Merrill Alumni Network. So thank you for your work on our alumni network, Olivia. And Jamie McIntyre, whom some of you in the audience may recognize as a longtime Merrill College adjunct lecturer. Jamie is the most senior of our panelists today. He's best known for his stint as CNN's military affairs and senior Pentagon correspondent, which he did from 1992 to 2008. He currently works as a senior writer for defense and national security at the Washington Examiner. Jamie loved being at Merrill College so much, he enrolled as a student, earning a Master of Arts degree. And I remember his thesis very well. And some of you, Jamie, you were a commencement speaker during one session, were you not?
Yes, for the college, yes.
For the college.
Yeah.
Jamie wrote about being at the Pentagon in his thesis on 9/11 and how information has followed him online. Misinformation has followed him online for years and years, and I will let him describe that experience. And once again, our panelists today want me to stress that they are speaking for themselves, not their employer. So what I'd like to talk about, I want to talk about everything. I was prepared and I came up with lots of questions, but every single day for the last several weeks, stories about the US military has morphed into stranger and stranger territory. And I have had a hard time keeping up even just in the last 3 days. How about if we start with this one? Over the last 10 months, the White House has made it clear its disdain for the press. Why has the Pentagon been at the forefront of moves against the press? I mean, and once a journalist for Fox, why is Pete Hegseth leading the charge against the media when other agencies are still somewhat welcoming to them? Anybody want to start with that?
I'll take a stab.
Yeah.
So, but I do want to just back up just a tiny bit, because I don't think the average American understands how unique the Pentagon was in terms of how the relationship between the military and the media worked. I arrived there in 1992. I was shocked and somewhat pleasantly surprised at the way that both the public affairs officers at the Pentagon and the officials there and the press got along in what was a very friendly adversarial relationship. The U.S. Pentagon was unique in that it was the only military headquarters that I'm aware of in the world that allowed reporters to have offices right inside their headquarters and then allowed them to pretty much go wherever they wanted to go and talk to whoever they wanted to talk to. It was an amazing way to cover a beat. And I would often give tours to people because not only could I go anywhere I wanted in the Pentagon, with the exception, of course, of highly classified areas, but I could take other people and show them. And the Pentagon, the halls of the Pentagon, many of them are like a museum with exhibits and history. It was an amazing thing to cover. No other, as I said, no other military headquarters that I'm aware of had such an arrangement. But this dated back to really the beginning of the Pentagon in World War II, and it was a shining example of how the American military valued the role of journalists and freedom of the press. And it was an amazing thing, and it all came to a crashing end with the Trump administration and the arrival of Pete Hegseth, who I don't think it's an understatement to say he launched an all-out war against the media. It started with kicking people out of their assigned workspaces in the Pentagon and essentially ending any briefings, backgrounders, taking an antagonistic view of any story that he viewed as critical. And it's just and I'll let some of the other people talk about how it's changed over the time. But it basically, Lucy, you said, how could a journalist at Fox take this thing? I think the answer to that is that Pete Hegseth was not a journalist at Fox. He was a personality, a presenter, a host, a talking head, but he clearly didn't embrace the ideals of journalism and a free flow of information. Under Hegseth, the Pentagon has become a place that wants to keep as much information away from the reporters, and it seems to me that their main motivation is they want to control the narrative, and they're really concerned that reporters are going to find out things that are going to be embarrassing. And without dominating too much more of the conversation and let other people talk, the other thing I would say is that it hasn't worked. The Pentagon press corps hasn't gone away. The coverage of the Pentagon hasn't diminished much. Reporters like the ones who are here now, Dan and Idrees, they still have sources and they still do excellent reporting. And the people who have Pentagon passes, we should understand these are not credentials to report. They're just credentials to let you get into the building. And since you can't go anywhere in the building or talk to anyone in the building, and the people who do talk to you don't want to tell you the truth, there isn't a whole lot of value of being in the Pentagon right now.
Yeah. Idrees, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with everything Jamie said, but I will add, I think for Hegseth, I think only a journalist can truly appreciate the power of the media. And I think that is the perspective Hegseth is coming from. I think his decades in the media, and I think Jamie's right? He was a host more than a reporter, but I think he understood the power journalists and journalism had. So if you're doing things that, might not stand up, under a bright light, he understood that it's the press that can actually shine a light on that. So the perspective I'm coming from is I think he knows the influence reporters have, the power that they have. And I think that sort of is behind some of at least his thinking on keeping them at a sort of arm's distance. And it's not just that, Hegseth has kicked reporters out of the building. He's essentially set the tone that other officials shouldn't talk to reporters as well. And, I think that's going to be something that's going to be more challenging to overcome in, the years and decades ahead.
Dan, are you out there? I can't see you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. And to get back to your initial question, I think it's important to note here the manner in which Secretary Hegseth took this job, which is to say his confirmation hearing right about a year ago now was extremely bruising, extremely contentious, wade through his own past behavior, sexual assault allegations, a variety of things that were just objectively difficult to deal with. And the reporting that I've picked up, and really everyone who's covered the beat, who's talked to people around Secretary Hegseth, is that he was deeply angry about the coverage through that period. So I think that's animating some of this. I think the fact that he walked in angry and operated from a place of anger at the very beginning is part of this. I also think the White House under President Trump, over time, we saw this in the first Trump term, and we're seeing it again, because he speaks so frequently, but also struggles with the facts so frequently, they centralize control as much as they can of the message. And I think that creates risk for any other cabinet official. If we ask you on a Tuesday morning about what happened, and you say it one way and you're not aware of what Trump just said or what Trump's about to say, you immediately contradict the president and you immediately run yourselves serious problems with keeping your job. That's something we saw a lot in the first tour. Secretary Esper, Secretary Mattis, some of the people we had at the Pentagon then, they tried in a lot of ways to maintain a normal relationship with the press. And to varying degrees had some success and a lot of strain as well. So I think that's important to note.
Olivia, I'm going to bring you into this conversation. You're dealing with, a room full of, I imagine most of our alums in this meeting are actively working in journalism. You took a slightly different route. And can you just explain to us, first of all, what it is that you do for the Department of Defense as a contractor?
Yes, absolutely. So I spent most of my time in the contracting space. And what that means is that the government signs a contract with the company that I work for me to provide services on their behalf. There are lots of limitations to that. I oftentimes have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I have a secret security clearance that gets me into certain rooms and areas and access to information that provides context to what I am putting out into the world. I can't say I'm a public affairs officer. I have to be very clear about that. But I can be a public affairs support lead, or I can be a communications lead. But I cannot actually speak on behalf of the government. That is something that is allowed for a civilian, a federal worker, or someone in uniform. But I, as a contractor, am not permitted to do that. But what's really unique about being a contractor versus a journalist is that I am restricted in what I can say or do or what have you. And so the freedoms that may be awarded to a journalist are not necessarily ones that I have as well. There are still some ethics that are with it. I do aligned to the public affairs community, and there are ethics and values that are aligned to that community. But at the end of the day, I am affiliated with the government, and that is who I need to align to in a lot of spaces. So, whatever the DOD or the DOW is pushing down to us in terms of restrictions, we have to align to those.
Can you explain? I mean, I have a brother in the military, but I still don't know what is a lead. What do you do on a daily basis?
Absolutely. So I am the person that is receiving the pitches from the journalists, the media queries that come into me. I take those questions or I take those interview requests and I go to the powers that be in my organization and I ask them to give me talking points or a response to that query. And then I send that back to the journalist, or I set up interviews, set up any sort of events or speaking engagements, creating talking point speeches for that. So kind of the logistics and working horse behind the scenes to elevate our leaders in the military in the public eye. So that can also look like press releases or doing social media coverage, or, we do a lot of activities that are very similar to working journalists, but again, with that mindset of we are focused with some blinders on about what our mission is, what our objectives are, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we are covering things without bias or covering all sides of the story.
And yeah, go ahead. Was that Jamie?
Yeah, can I just inject something here? And I'm going to say something that I think maybe might take people by surprise. Maybe my colleagues might not even agree with me, but the way the Pentagon worked during the more than 30 years that I covered it, and this is I think this thing people might think is surprising, is that the public affairs officers, and understand that each of the individual services have their own public affairs office. The Office of Secretary of Defense has a public affairs office. There are hundreds of public affairs officers in they're either military or civilian, who worked on a daily basis with reporters, because you could wander the building and go down to all these public affairs offices and talk to them about anything. And the one thing that the public affairs officers and the reporters generally had in common is a desire to get the story correct. It's adversarial, and when we're reporting news that doesn't is not very complimentary to the Defense Department, there can be some tension. But both sides are trying to get the best version of an accurate story out there, and that was what made working in the Pentagon so valuable, was that you developed relationships with people, and credibility was the coin of the realm, and it worked both ways. Public affairs officers, if they gave you accurate information, good context, you would begin to trust them. And if they saw you writing a story that was that acknowledged all the aspects of the context, and gave them a fair shake, then they respected you. And that's all gone now. And I just point out that Sean Parnell, who's the chief Pentagon spokesperson, in reaction to the Washington Post story about Pete Hegseth and the strike on the boat in September, issued a statement that said something I don't have it in front of me, but it was that the Post had fabricated this story and made it up out of whole cloth, and there was nothing, it was completely false, it was fake news. And that was just like 2 days ago. And pretty much now all of it has been confirmed. And we have more details too. It was not. But that's their approach, is just attack, call everything fake news, lie. That wasn't a story that was, and launch ad hominem attacks on reporters and call them names. And that's what we're dealing with now. And that's a complete turnaround from the kind of relationship that the military and the media has enjoyed for decades at the Pentagon.
Yeah. Idrees, Dan, you want to join in on comment on that?
No, I think that's generally on point. It has been a uniquely challenging year. I've been on this beat since 2008. I graduated in December 2008 and jumped right into covering the military after. It often is contentious. It's a personal subject. People are emotionally invested in the issue. If they are in the service, they want to see their service generally look good. That's to be understood. Most people kind of get that the idea is to explain what happened. And we're in a spot now where explaining what happened is immediately fraught. We have, many of us have experienced threats, not from public affairs officials, but, from people that are sort of aligned with Secretary Hegseth and President Trump, to the point of, on occasion, even needing to consider police or security. So it is just a challenging year, and you have to have a thick skin.
Idrees?
No, I think that's absolutely correct. And, we're entering this era where, the global war on terror is past the United States, but, the U.S. military is sending tens of thousands of troops to the Caribbean, right? And it's a nuanced story, and not having journalists there who have the relationship with public affairs officers, I think is going to hurt the U.S. military just as much, and ultimately the American people and people around the world, and it's quite unfortunate.
Think about all the effort that the Rumsfeld administration went to embed U.S. reporters and even foreign reporters with U.S. troops in Iraq, all the logistics of that, and then compare that to the fact that we actually had a war earlier this year that we lost. It lasted 52 days. The Pentagon declared war on the Houthi rebels in Yemen in order to restore freedom of navigation to the Red Sea. After 52 days and really achieving almost nothing, except losing a few aircraft and drones, and accidentally killing some innocent people on the ground. President Trump lost interest in it, declared victory. There were no reporters who were able to cover that. There was barely any. There was one briefing, and there was one statement from the U.S. Central Command, and then the president pretended that they won the war and that the Houthis had surrendered, and nothing has changed. That's the way they want to fight a war, and then without any coverage, and then they want to tell you who won, and don't count on them to tell you the truth.
Olivia, I want to. I've been curious. Has your job changed at all since the Trump administration took office?
Absolutely. It's quite the loaded question, actually. I've worked across 3 different presidential administrations. I will say that I wanted to echo what Jamie said about the relationship between public affairs officers and journalists, and that we want that to be a symbiotic relationship. We want you to help us, and we want us to help you. We want it to be like that. But at the same time, I recall many moons ago, I actually was a journalist for a government-sponsored publication called Undersea Warfare Magazine, which was the official publication of the submarine force. I went on a media trip, actually, and I was underway on a submarine, and I was treated just like all the journalists. And that actually included, once we got off the sub, them reviewing the photos that we took, reviewing the video that we took. So even back then, and that was during the Obama administration, they were but that, I will have to say that there was a part of that was for security reasons, making sure that we didn't take any photos or video of secret spaces or sensitive spaces on the submarine. But there has definitely been a level of, what's the word I'm looking for? Just, making sure that things are very particular when it comes to coverage. But one thing with this most recent administration, again, with me being a contractor and us trying to align to the Department of War as much as possible, one of the things that we were asked to do was to remove, if we had pronouns in our email signature, we were asked to remove those. So, it really is very interesting to see things that were not even thought of beforehand. Now there's lots of rules and regulations surrounding that. Specifically, social media too is really, really curated now. You probably have seen a lot less posts than you have in the past, especially with the government shutdown. That was the very first thing that people locked down on. A lot of accounts there's been a lapse in appropriations, therefore there will be a lack of coverage. And that also sends a little bit of a message there. We're not prioritizing that free flow of information like we have in the past when there is an issue with coverage or people in office. So, I think that the Secretary of War's account still went on normally, but so many other accounts, not so much.
Yeah. There are so many, like I said at the beginning, every 6 hours, there's something new going on. But one of the amazing things to me that happened was about the story of shooting, drug traffickers in the Caribbean, and in particular, there were 6 U.S. senators who have background in military and intelligence, who basically came together and said, "We are very, very concerned that our soldiers are being forced to violate the UCMJ." You see that all there. Would one of you explain, Jamie, Dan, the Uniform Code of Military Justice and what these senators were trying to get across to the public, and then and why have they gone after Senator Kelly? Somebody want to take that on?
Yeah, I can take a stab. So the military has its own set of laws, basically. I mean, in covering it is unlike covering any other court case. Different kinds of hearings, different nomenclature, different charges. Obviously, the military is a business where killing does occur. There are lawful kills. There are lawful kills frequently, especially when you're in a war. But there is a code and guidelines to guide those. Authorization of force, whether or not you are literally given permission to shoot, is a part of the discussion. Rules of engagement is another term you'll hear thrown around, even in the movies. And those vary by conflict, but basically the idea is, depending on what happens, you may or may not have permission to shoot. That is a part of the discussion. And, you know, in this particular case, we have not declared war on Venezuela. We have not declared any kind of formal war, even on the cartels. So we're working in a situation where they have declared these basically groups of criminals, the ones that even qualify as criminals, as terrorists. And they're trying to apply the old set of logic from the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and otherwise to this set of current operations. That has created a lot of concern. That has created kind of quiet conversations where your average mid-ranking officer is checking with lawyers on the side in his own free time. Hey, what do I do if? There's a lot of those kinds of conversations right now. I had a discussion with an old Marine Corps friend not long ago, where they're trying to make sense of what to do if somebody in that family is assigned to the particular task force. They had to at least have that discussion. Husband and wife, they were both Marines. So, I mean, it's just a particularly fraught time. So you have these 6 lawmakers who raise the question and say, hey, you are, you know, basically not allowed to follow an unlawful order, which opens the can of sardines over what is a lawful order. And we've had that discussion this year over numerous issues, not only Venezuela, but also these deployments to American cities, which have included active duty infantry troops on occasion. And a lot of those things are getting played out through the court system, but in the short term, they're happening anyway. So it has created a lot of concerns. So these senators, congressmen raised the question and basically said, hey, reminder, you're not obligated to follow an order that's unlawful. President Trump and Trump administration officials took exception to that, basically the implication that they might be suggesting that something here isn't legal. And they are not able to go after all these individuals because some of these are private citizens, but uniquely Senator Kelly, because he is a retired military officer, they are able to, in their eyes, open a case against him and basically see if there's anything they can get to stick against him. This is something President Trump wanted to do during the first administration. He raised the idea of doing it to General Stan McChrystal and Admiral Bill McRaven for criticizing the president. He was walked off of that at the time by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, and Mark Esper, the secretary, who was a Trump appointee. We're on uncharted waters in that regard.
And
Yeah. Jamie.
I just make a couple of quick points. First of all, these the senators and lawmakers attracted the ire of Trump by simply stating what the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, says about troops not following unlawful orders. That's all they said. I mean, any legal expert will tell you that should Mark Kelly go to court-martial, there's pretty much no way he could be convicted. In fact, it's not even clear you could get a convening authority to bring the case. And the other part about this is the Trump administration has come up with this rationale for the war against the wooden boats in the Caribbean and concocted some legal theory turning it into an armed conflict, an undeclared war, but we haven't seen it. It's classified. Members of Congress have seen it, but they're not allowed to talk about it because it's classified. So we don't actually know what their argument is about why these strikes would be legal, because they seem on the face of it to be something that would not be legal, treating criminals who are not posing an immediate threat and executing them. I mean, you can imagine if they stopped these boats, and got on the boat and then gunned down all the people on the boat, we would be horrified. But essentially, that's what they're doing, except they're doing it from the air. And this latest incident really raises the question about, Dan said, what is an unlawful order? And the Trump administration accused these lawmakers of sedition, that is, instigating insubordination by members of the military. But the laws are pretty clear. Sometimes it's not clear what a lawful order is or not. And if you're an enlisted person and you're given an order, you're supposed to carry it out. And the officers are supposed to determine what's lawful and not lawful. So they're not supposed to be issuing unlawful orders. But there are some situations there that any member of the military is supposed to recognize as being unlawful. And one of the main ones is shooting wounded troops on the battlefield who are no longer in the fight. And that's a situation posed by this latest incident that was revealed by the Washington Post, excuse me, where the UCMJ and the Pentagon's own law, a manual of the law of war, specifies, they even give the example of sailors shipwrecked after an attack who are, bobbing around in the sea. You can't go around and shoot them because once they're out of the fight, you have an obligation to rescue them. The Nazis in World War II would kill people sailors who had survived the sinking of a ship. But that's not what Americans do. It's not what we uphold the law of armed conflict. And one of the dynamics that's going on here is in normal times, in a normal Pentagon, there would be briefings. The Pentagon would come out, their spokesman would come out, we would ask them these tough questions, and they would answer them, or they would make an answer, or they'd bring a JAG officer out to brief us about what the rules of engagement were. There would be this interplay between the press. But right now, we're getting the mushroom treatment, which is being kept in the dark and fed manure. And that's the way they're treating the press. They don't engage. Most of the appearances that Hegseth makes are not publicized ahead of time. The transcripts of what he says are not published. These are all things that used to be routine. They just want to operate in their own narrow space, and they don't want any pesky reporters bothering them, except for the ones who have pledged that they're going to be totally loyal and tout the company line.
So, Idrees, a few months ago, they came with an agreement that they wanted journalists to sign if they would want to continue to have access to the Pentagon. There were several versions, at least two that I can think of this. Can you explain what it is that the journalists in the Pentagon press corps were asked to do, and how that decision making happened?
Yeah, so Dan, jump in if I get something wrong, because it was quite a lengthy back and forth that we sort of went through. So, going back to really January when the Trump administration took over, there have been a number of steps that have been taken to essentially, reduce the footprint of the press in the building. And it started off with taking away the desks from a number of outlets, including Dan's desk at the Pentagon. We all have desks within the Pentagon, have had them for decades, and they essentially called it a quote unquote rotation system. But essentially was taking away desks from outlets like CNN, Washington Post, New York Times, and NBC News. And that really, I think, set the tone. And a couple of weeks ago, maybe more than a month ago now, we were notified that there would be a document that any journalist who wanted to keep their Pentagon credentials would need to sign. The early version, I think was extremely problematic, and most outlets sort of looked at it and said, this is not going to work. And so the Pentagon Press Association, essentially a group of journalists who represent everyone in the Pentagon press corps, went back, talked to each of the outlets and said, with their lawyers, by the way, said, look, this is not going to work because it restricts the journalist's ability to report fairly and accurately. Why don't we have a discussion about, what changes make sense and what we just cannot agree to? Long story short, the final version had, I think, Dan, it would be fair to say, it's still problematic. But I think one of the biggest issues was this sort of acknowledgement of Pentagon policy that journalists would not solicit information, whether classified or unclassified, that had not already been cleared. And I think that really came, that is the basics of journalism, right, is to get information. And I think acknowledging a policy like that is what really made it problematic for really all journalists in the Pentagon press corps, except one news outlet. And it led to frankly, a pretty easy decision for all the outlets to say, look, this is going to open up, a can of worms, potential litigation. It just doesn't make sense. And it's better and probably more ethical to just decline to sign this and be on our way. And I think that's what it came down to.
Well, it was full frontal assault on the First Amendment rights of the media to publish information that it gets. And it was pretty audacious, actually. And it was probably, do you think they expected anybody to sign it?
There were conservative outlets, right, that worked at the Pentagon, like Fox News and others. And I don't know if they expected them to sign, but it was pretty amazing to see the level of solidarity, including from conservative outlets. I actually don't think they cared, quite frankly. I think in their mind, look, if they sign, great, we've got some outlets on our site. If they don't sign, well, we'll get more sort of friendly outlets, because there are some, including Fox News, which has Jen Griffin, who is a very, very good journalist who has been a thorn in Hegseth's side, in his view, at least. He's lashed at her publicly. So I think for him, not having her around is probably a lot easier than having her around.
No, I think the whole idea was to just get everybody out of it. They didn't want the press there. They were shocked when they got there and discovered the aggressive and very experienced press corps was there and was going to be trying to hold them accountable. And they just wanted them to go away. And they went on a systematic campaign of making life more and more and more difficult until we left. And I think they would declare victory. I don't think if you ask Pete Hegseth today, are you sorry that all these people left? He'd say, hell no, I'm glad they're gone. I never liked them in the first place. They're all fake journalists. That's his attitude. And they came in, they saw the way everything worked, and had worked for decades. And they didn't like it, so they set about changing it. And they did. And I think a real interesting question will be, when this period passes, will we ever go back to what we had before? Because, once the bureaucrats and others get comfortable with the fact that they don't have to deal with so many reporters, I don't think they're going to be anxious to sort of get them back in there and get this system going again. But it worked. The thing is, if you asked any of the departing defense secretaries, and I go back as far as Cheney, what they thought of the Pentagon press corps, to a person, they would have told you, and often they said this in public as they were leaving, that they were more impressed with the expertise and the professionalism of the Pentagon press corps. And one of the reasons is people, when they get an expertise like Idrees or Dan, they stay on the beat because it takes so long to get sources and get connected, that we had a very experienced press corps, a very responsible press corps, very few problems with anybody reporting any classified information that would compromise a mission or jeopardize troops. That just doesn't happen. And they would tell you how impressed they were. I mean, pretty much you can go look it up. They all felt that way until this administration came in and decided that we were the enemy.
The new crew of people that are coming in. I read something yesterday or today. Basically, the Pentagon is going to entertain them this week. They're going to have access to Secretary Hegseth. They're going to, I don't know, probably go to the White House and shake hands with the president. I don't know. But who are these folks? And what are they likely to write about? And what might they have access to that the regular, or are they just going to be satisfied with this? Anybody?
Yeah, I've had an interesting day. Idrees knows what I'm talking about. I think there's about 4 different outlets from this new group that all claim to take my desk, one after another today. Kind of an I am Spartacus kind of feel to it. Like just everybody wanted my desk. It was very surreal and very ridiculous, frankly. But I think
who told you about it?
They're posting it on X.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, with photos.
Okay.
And when like the 3rd or 4th one, Laura Loomer was one, a couple other, kind of obvious right-wing activists. They're not journalists. It's meant to troll, right? It's not meant to break news. It's not meant to inform the public. So I think what we're going to see going forward is this is a group that did, in theory, sign these rules. And they're either going to be restricted by these rules and really not be able to report a whole lot that isn't basically an announcement, or you're going to see them fall by the wayside as one by one they run into trouble, reporting something they didn't want out there. And I think you're probably going to see a little bit of both. I think some of them are going to very closely adhere. And I think some of them are just, rabble rousers, have a reputation for being such, and it's a matter of time before you end up with some weird dust up there.
I'm going to make a prediction that this new press corps that they're touting is going to be a complete non-factor. They're not, the reporters who left went to the Pentagon every morning and left at night and were there every day. They're not going to, Laura Loomer is not going to want to go sit at the Pentagon where she can get no information except what the Pentagon can put out in a press release, and go there and sit every day at a desk where you can't walk around, and the only people you can talk to are like 3 people who are going to tell you the same thing. I'm just going to tell you, they're not really a Pentagon press corps. They're just it's just another part of performance art.
Second prediction, half these people are not local.
Yeah.
They're not going to be in the building regularly. They're here this week. They'll get their photographs out of that.
Laura Loomer is not
but
going
they're
to
going
be
to go back to
sitting
their
there
respective states.
Yeah. And so they're not really replacing the Pentagon press corps with a, more friendly press corps. They're just, and the current Pentagon press corps hasn't gone anywhere. They're all I've covered. Just read the stories that my colleagues are breaking all the time, whether it's at in Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal or the Post or Reuters. They're breaking stories all the time based on sources, and it's not stopping them at all that they're not sitting in the Pentagon at their desks there. In fact, the main benefit accrues to the Pentagon of having reporters where they have constant contact with them and build relationships with them. It results in better coverage for the Pentagon. They're the losers in all of this. We're not the losers.
I told as you know, I teach media law, longtime media lawyer, dealt with for the last 25 years before. And I told my class a couple of weeks ago, they said, what's going to happen? And I said, the place is going to leak like a sieve. And there are people who are going to be in the Pentagon, in the US military, who are going to want the public to know what's going on. These reporters are not going to stop. Now, there are certain things, my guess is that a lot more top secret stuff is going to come out. Now, there are things you're not going to be able to do if you're not in that building, but you're still able to do a heck of a lot, aren't you, Idrees?
Yeah, I think we don't know what we're missing, I guess, until we know. There's no way to really know what we're missing. And I don't know, Dan, how you feel about this, but what I have noticed is I'm talking to just as many people, if not more. It's just very different, right? It's maybe working a bit harder, a bit longer, right? Our sources who, for example, were in the building, right? You don't really get cell service at the Pentagon unless you're in like one or two corridors or like by a bathroom stall. And so you're probably talking to them after work when they're at home on a secure line rather than just bumping into them in the Pentagon. So it's definitely had an effect, and it's tough to know what the effect is until, stories actually come out about what we're missing. But it's also made more people come out. There are people who are watching operations take place in Venezuela who are sort of looking at troops being deployed to American cities and saying, "Hey, that's not why I took the oath," right? And let's chat. And I'm sure every journalist at the Pentagon has had more people reach out to them as a result of this. And the one thing, just going back to the previous question, Secretary of Defense Hegseth is supposed to have some sort of meet and greet, potentially a briefing with these new media reporters, I think on Wednesday. And what I think he's going to find, or what I'm looking for at least, is a lot of these journalists are not journalists, they're activists, and they have agendas. And a lot of these agendas are sort of isolationist, America first. And he might be faced with some questions about sort of these deployments that are taking place in the Caribbean. How do they fit with the America First agenda? So it might be a very interesting occasion where the journalists he brought in thinking they would be, sort of softballs. Many of them might, but some of them might actually not like what he's doing and don't think it fits in with the sort of Trump America First agenda. And he might, get some tough questions. That's maybe an optimistic, hopeful view, but I think it is a possibility.
The other thing that's going to be really different is, I was at the Pentagon for a lot of wars. It was like the Pentagon full employment policy when I was there. There was always a war to cover. But if the United States goes to war with Venezuela, under the old system, the Pentagon briefing room would be packed with reporters and cameras doing live reports from the Pentagon. In between their time on the air, they would be talking to sources, talking to people in the public affairs, talking to officials about what was happening to get the most accurate idea of how the war was progressing. If they're going to be airstrikes the first night, or is there going to be something, what kinds of munitions were employed, how many troops were involved. All of that information is you get. And all the TV networks and the radio networks, the wire services, they're pumping out information constantly, and we're not going to see that. We're just going to be we'll be reporting more from what we can get from other sources, because the Pentagon's not going to be briefing us or telling us what's happening.
Well, and this kind of leads me to a question I had hoped we'd get you to talk about a little bit, Jamie. When you don't have access to really good, reliable information, people make stuff up. And you were at the Pentagon on 9/11, and you went on the air. And could you just give our audience a little bit of a description of not so much that day, but the aftermath, and how the public, certain conspiracy theorists, made stuff up?
Well, I'm the only, I think I'm one of the few Merrill College graduates who often refers people to read my master's thesis, which you can find not only in the Merrill Library, but if you go to Elements of Disbelief at blogspot.com, you can read the thesis. Basically, I'm going to make this short because it looks like we're coming up on deadline, but basically, something I said when I was covering the attack, the aftermath of the attack on the Pentagon, was taken out of context and twisted to mean just the opposite of what I had said by the way it was edited. It made it sound like I was saying that there was no evidence that a plane hit the Pentagon. And this became part of the conspiracy theories. It got into some of these fake documentaries about conspiracy theories about 9/11, and it's set me on this path to try to correct the record. And the short lesson I learned, and which I wrote about in my thesis, is that it is extremely difficult to dislodge false beliefs once somebody has formed an emotional attachment to them. I spent 10 years after 9/11 explaining to anybody who was interested that yes, a plane actually did hit the Pentagon. I was there. I saw the pieces of the plane. And in that time, I engaged with a lot of these so-called 9/11 truthers who didn't believe that, who thought either a missile or a bomb went off or whatever. And in that time of talking to them and explaining and using logic and facts and reason, I never changed a single person's mind, not once. And the lesson I took from it was the persistence of misinformation and disinformation in our information ecosystem. It's a plague, really. And of course, since then, we now have the social media has even gotten much more ubiquitous, and the amount of misinformation and disinformation is just it's overwhelming. It's like a flood. And if you feel that your job as a journalist is to bring facts to bear and help people understand things better and make more rational decisions, it's a very frustrating time when you find that no matter how many times you do a fact check on something that's demonstrably false, still millions of people believe it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. For those of you who have questions, please put them in the chat. And I think in about 15 or 20 minutes, Eugene will open it up and we will we'll address some of those questions from the audience. But in the meantime, Olivia, we've just been discussing how things have changed and whether or not the public is actually going to get access to truthful information. In the new ecosystem that we're operating in and that you're operating in, what are your fears about what can happen?
I would like to say that nothing will change, but I think that would just be living in some sort of fantasy world. So, I mean, I plan to continue to be committed to do my job as a public affairs person, which is bring the information that's happening in my organization to light in the public, whether that is journalist or, social media posts or events or anything like that. I think what that's actually going to end up looking like is just a very reduced version of that, a much more curated version, a lot of no's versus yeses when it comes to going to conferences or speaking at engagements or what have you. I think, like I spoke about me going on a submarine for a media cruise several years ago. I think that type of access is not going to be allowable going forward. So I really do fear for that. But like I said, I plan to do what I can. But like I said at the very top of the conversation, I am I'm restricted by what my employer has asked of me, what the contract has asked of me, so that's where things get a little bit dicey.
If I could interject there, I think we've already seen a good example of what can go wrong here with the shooting of the National Guard members in D.C. last week. There was about a 20-minute window where the West Virginia governor had said that they were dead. And it was not true. Only one of them was fatally wounded. The other one's still fighting for his life as of tonight. And that's the kind of thing we have seen in the past when we're in the building. You will literally see, sometimes literally, somebody sprint to the journalists because somebody got it wrong. And they're trying to get to the other journalists before they leap to the same mistake. And in this case, it went out everywhere. Numerous news alerts, numerous national, because the governor had said it. And that's an example. That's a missed opportunity, and they didn't have the ability to fix it.
Yeah. I've seen, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, but what seems to me to be happening is there are some very senior generals, admirals, colonels, who are very quietly, it appears some of them have been obviously fired, but some of them, just sort of from where I sit, look like they're just trying to melt away because they can't take it anymore. Is that, have you noticed any of that?
I think so. I think so. In Trump 1.0, there was the Pentagon was seen as the resistance, quote unquote resistance, right? There was Mattis and then General Dunford at the time, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And there was frustration with the Pentagon because it was seen as slow walking Trump's decisions, specifically at the time it was the Syria withdrawal or whatever, you have. That isn't happening anymore. There is, as far as I can see, and in my experience, very little sort of overt resistance to what Trump wants. And part of it is Secretary Hegseth is, operationalizing many of the requests and demands from Trump. Whereas, a Secretary Mattis or a Secretary Esper might say, hey, actually sending troops to American cities, not really something we should be doing. Why don't we do this instead? And, almost diverting to something less controversial. That's not happening anymore. And I think you're right. There really has not been major resignations in the face of troop deployments to American cities as a result of these boat strikes. The generals and admirals who I think a lot of people expected to be sort of the face of maybe some level of reality just isn't there in the same way. Now again, there are 3 years left, and maybe they're just waiting for something to happen, a sort of a red line or a tripwire closer to the end of the 3 years if they need to. But as of now, the Pentagon is not any sort of resistance when it comes to the president.
Wow. I was hoping you were going to tell me something else.
And maybe I'm wrong, Dan. Are you seeing anything that I'm missing?
I think Admiral Halsey resigning, we're still trying to get to the bottom of what that story is. The admiral that was in charge of the operations in the Caribbean, that was immediately conspicuous. That is typically a 3-year tour, 3-year job. 6 months in, he's leaving. No explanation why. That raised a lot of eyebrows. And that's a story that I think we're all still chasing, trying to make sense of what led to that. Was it specifically the Venezuela discussion? Was it something else? Or was it some sort of turf war over who's in charge down there? I mean, I think we're all waiting to kind of see that. But yeah, I mean, and this goes for, I think, like my peer group age-wise at this point, many of them are colonels or coming up on colonel. And yes, I know people that are already planning to retire. And some of them had, high ambitions, and they just look at it. Not only it's not a question just of, is it worth it dealing with the headaches and the rapid changes of policy and the confusion that can go with that. It's also in some cases the fear of being stuck in the middle of something that's going to stick to you professionally, and they'd rather just do something else with their lives.
So the military officers are they're in a difficult position because they all believe in the bedrock principle of civilian control of the military. The Army Chief of Staff and the Chief of Naval Operations are not in charge of those services. Those are in charge by civilian service secretaries, and they know that's part of their ethos is that they. As long as it's a legal order, they salute smartly and carry it out. That's how it's supposed to work. Even if they think the policy is bad enough, then their only option is to resign. And if they think it's really terrible, they can resign and make clear why they resigned. I think some of the officers who aren't saying anything are just figuring they're going to make it to their retirement. And you have to remember also that in the military, if you retire as a 4-star or 3-star officer, admiral or general, you don't automatically get retirement at that rank. It has to be confirmed by the Senate. And if you were take Admiral Halsey for example, if he were to have resigned immediately and said he was doing it because he didn't support the operation off the coast of Venezuela and that he thought the strikes were illegal. If he were to say something like that, you can imagine the retribution that Trump would, he would be putting his retirement and his family at risk. So it would take a lot of courage and financial fortitude if you were going to resign and make a statement out of it. So I think there is some quiet quitting going on. It's like just a lot of people, a lot of the senior officers that I've talked to just say this isn't the kind of, it's they don't they don't get the same enjoyment and sense of reward that they were getting before. And I won't go any further than that because I don't want to get anybody in trouble.
One thing we saw after 9/11, there were people leaking stuff to journalists. I mean, every administration has leakers. But it looks to me like there are plenty of people who are operating in the US military who are willing to talk. Some really outstanding journalists are getting some great stories. What we saw after 9/11 is that often leads to subpoenas on journalists. Now, you can make an argument that, the old-fashioned slap a journalist with a subpoena to reveal a confidential source is kind of old-fashioned and everything, but I can see it happening.
Yes,
I used
I
to
can
defend
see
a
it.
lot of those people. And this is where leakers at the Pentagon and in the intelligence agencies run squarely into the Department of Justice. And do I personally think that Pam Bondi would resist subpoenaing a journalist? There's no way. But are you still? Are sources still willing to talk to you in their off hours, Dan and Idrees? And
I think
sure
some
looks
sources
like it.
dry up, and I think other sources are more inclined to. And I think some of it depends over time. Like there are people I was talking to for one storyline earlier this year where they were extremely helpful, landing several scoops in the process, and then at some point they get a little queasy, and that's understandable too, right? Like they're having to make their own calculations. Tradecraft is really important right now. You got to think about how you're doing it. You got to talk to your sources about how you're doing it. How can we have this conversation? How can I describe you if you're anonymously? What kind of digital footprint are you leaving? All of those things matter a great deal.
Can you talk a little bit about tradecraft? I mean, you kind of went really quickly, but it's very, very important. And our students who are watching, I think I'd like them to hear this.
Yeah, I mean, it's if you're making a call on an open phone line, there's at least a record that that phone call occurred and that it was 7 minutes and 37 seconds long. That's the kind of thing that can draw attention, particularly when you're calling somebody who works in the bowels of the Pentagon on your free time. And even if it's somebody who you know well and maybe went to their kid's birthday party 2 years ago, like it's more problematic now, even if it's like a completely friendly phone call that's not professional in nature. So that's part of it. And then it becomes like, how are you going about sharing information? In some cases, the information right now is not necessarily classified. In most cases, it's not. There were a series of very politically explosive stories this year with sort of the knife fight on Hegseth's front office team. None of those were, like classified informations. It was, it was a matter of who was up, who was down, who was getting fired, who was pushing who out. Those are stories they didn't want out there, but they also didn't have like the Justice Department implications that some of these others probably do.
Mm-hmm.
I think, for all of us, we're spending a lot more time on stuff that, like, again, I've done Trump 1.0, like Dan and Jamie and Biden and Obama, and you're just spending a lot of time just understanding how, technology works, right? Like Signal versus WhatsApp, which one is better? How long can they keep your metadata? And so you're almost understanding how these apps work in a way that allows you to then protect the sources that you have. And Dan's right. In some cases, you're like, all right, this is way too hot right now. I'm not going to reach out to this person because I know A, it might put them under risk, and B, I want to save it for something maybe bigger and better. And so you're really thinking through and making these trade-offs in a way that honestly I don't think we had to maybe like 6 months ago.
Jamie,
Yeah, I
go
just
ahead.
say it's definitely harder now, and the technology has changed, and I agree that this administration would not hesitate to make life as difficult as possible for any journalists that they thought um, had gotten access to some information that they didn't want to be published. Um, it's a lot, I write a newsletter now, and I'm not so much in the breaking news, highly sourced field. I'm more in the using my experience to provide context and try to, um, you know, curate all the information and make it somehow digestible. But in the days when I was at the Pentagon, when I used to actually be at the Pentagon, that's all I did all day was walk around. And of course, we did have the advantage that we could just talk to somebody in the hallway or in their office or in the men's room um, or the ladies' room if we happen to not be a man. Um, and there was cover for that, but they're tracking everything these days, and um, they're so interested in slapping down anything that conflicts with their official narrative, and you saw that really in the bombing of the Iranian nuclear facilities, where a perfectly legitimate story from the the Defense Intelligence Agency said that it wasn't clear the extent of the damage when Trump was saying that they had been obliterated. Um, and they don't seem to be able to deal with that kind of nuance. They just wanted to denounce the story. They didn't want anybody reporting the story. And of course, we haven't even mentioned this, but they now have this website where they want to call it the Hall of Shame for media outlets that they don't who report things that they don't like. And they claim, and they go on there and they claim these news organizations all reported things that weren't true, and they have a whole list of stories that are absolutely true. They're all true, but they've concocted an argument that to try to convince people that things that are true are not true, and things that are not true are true. And that is the definition of propaganda. And that's what a lot of this stuff falls into the area of propaganda. We are seeing an administration who has no compunction about saying things that are demonstrably untrue and then insisting that they are true.
Dan, I interrupted you. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I wanted to walk it back because we've been talking about this administration specifically. I think it's a uniquely challenging time here. But I would say that I've been on this beat for pushing 18 years, and virtually every single year over year, the axis has been reduced across numerous presidents, numerous defense secretaries. So I think that also is a part of this. And I think it made it easier to do what they're doing now. When I first started embedding in combat in 2010, I was out with an infantry unit with literally no public affairs officer with us for weeks at a time. You would kind of be assigned to a unit. You're reporting freely. You have rules to follow. You can get kicked out if you don't follow the rules. That was generally the vibe. Went back a couple of years later. You had a relatively young sort of minder that was ostensibly there to keep you safe, but also I think was there to keep you on the right track. And then over time, it's your ability to talk to regular people, not just public affairs officers. For me, the money's made talking to people really doing the job rather than somebody who's talking to somebody doing the job. And it over time has, degraded. And there have been times, I was involved in one situation some years ago. I was offered an embed to spend time with special forces in Afghanistan. And the discussion was basically, if today's story goes well, we'll let you embed next week. And I said, cool, I'll do a story. It'll be straight laced. It'll be good. And we'll be ready to go. And they didn't like the headline and the embed got yanked. Now that's 8, 9 years ago. So this has happened over time, and every year it's a little bit less access. And it has made people who have been on the beat a while, I think, more valuable because you can reach into these old places you knew and old places you visited and people that are, probably a couple more ranks more senior. Long term, my concern is if I'm a 25-year-old reporter right now trying to learn covering the Pentagon under this particular set of rules, it's not going to be easy.
Right. Catherine Foxhall in our audience points out, and she's done a lot of work on access to many, many agencies. She points out that most agencies in the federal government have begun in the last few decades to keep reporters out of facilities and banning employees from talking to reporters without, over the assistance of public information officers. How, Olivia, have you been involved in that as a contractor? Are you required to sit in and supervise interviews?
Absolutely, yes. And I think the issue here is that we just want to make sure that the person who is being quoted just doesn't provide anything that's incorrect in the first place. And then another thing that we often involve is the JAG. And I know, Jamie, you mentioned this in one of the earlier questions. Whenever a media query would come in or there would be an interview or something, we always involve the judge advocate general to just make sure that we are crossing our T's, dotting our I's, not saying anything that we shouldn't be saying, not receiving anything that we shouldn't be receiving. And what I mean by that is that we don't want that there to be any sort of perception of preferential treatment or anything like that, which always made conferences really fun to be around with an admiral, because the amount of swag that would try to be pushed on them, they said, nope, we have to claim every single thing we take away from this conference. Please do not take that stress ball or pen or what have you. So there's definitely a lot of restrictions, and just it's because we want.
So you sit there and a reporter asks a question. Idrees or Dan, can you give an example? You've probably been in this situation. Can you come up with an example of a question where you were just stopped? For the person you were talking to was blocked from answering? How does this work?
So in some instances, you will have a briefing with, I don't know, I'm going to make it up, right? The head of U.S. Central Command agrees to sit down with you and do a briefing, but, the parameters are, we're here to discuss the operations in Syria. As a journalist, you don't, you can say this is what you want to talk about, but as a journalist, I'm going to ask what I want to ask. And so there will be instances where, you talk about Syria, but then you have a question on Iraq. And, there will be instances where the public affairs officer is going to jump in and say, hey, actually, you can't ask that because this briefing we agreed was only about Syria. Most cases, the 4-star or whoever will jump in and say, I'm happy to answer that question. But from a public affairs officer's, I think, standpoint, it's like, look, the parameters of the interview were this, you went off parameter, and so my job is to bring it back into that lane. And again, most of the times the people you're talking to are like, don't worry, I got this. But there will be instances where they're like, yeah, no, I can't answer that in many cases, end the interview and walk away. So that's an example. And it could be really about anything.
I would just make 2 points. One is, Hegseth is right when he says they don't allow reporters to do this at any place else, not any other military installation, and most of the government buildings in Washington. The possible exception is Capitol Hill, where reporters can wander around sections of Capitol Hill, but not everywhere. And so that's still a place where you can walk around, cover by walking around and talking to people. But yeah, as I said in my opening comments, the Pentagon was unique about that. The thing what I found when I was interviewing people was these, when you're interviewing senior officials, whether they're civilian or military, they're all senior people, and they can handle questions. If they don't want to answer something, they just tell you they're not going to answer that. They can always hide behind some sort of it's classified, or I can't talk about it in this setting, or something like that. Secretary Rumsfeld had a clever thing that he instituted, and I'm sorry to see it go away, is whenever Rumsfeld would do an interview with anyone, a newspaper reporter, anyone in his office, he would have it recorded and transcribed. And once the reporter had, um, published a story or the interview had aired, they would publish on their website the entire unedited transcript of the entire interview. And they did that because Rumsfeld sometimes felt like he was quoted out of context or that quotes had been cherry picked. And he wanted anybody who was operating off that story, whether they're another reporter or whether they were somebody in government, to have access to exactly what he said and how he said it. And also has a self-correcting effect, because if reporters are interviewing the secretary and they want to pick a few juicy quotes, they're going to know that once their story hits and the other reporters start trying to follow it up, that they're going to be able to go back to the original source material and see what the context was. I thought that was very clever. It ended when Rumsfeld left, but it's one of the ways I think it actually served both the reporters and the person that they were interviewing. And by the way, if you ever do get interviewed for a story, you should make your own recording so you have a record of what you said. I should have recorded this, but I'll get it from you.
It's okay. It's being recorded. Hello, Jeremy Barr. I think this next question is from Jeremy. Considering the stress of the beat and the increased resistance to the coverage, have any of you thought about leaving the beat and covering something else? Or have the Trump administration's attempt to curb press access made you even more committed to it? One at a time. Dan, how about you?
I mean, there are days where I question, well, do I want to do this another 20 years? I kind of feel like I'm kind of in the middle. I'm 43, 44 this month. Some of that was the case before, though. And I think for the short term, there is an animating function, and I think a duty of sorts that I feel of, like, I have a set of sources that if I walk away from the job won't be easy to replace right now. I can be uniquely helpful to my fellow citizens in this moment. I don't know how long I'll feel that way, but right now that's how I feel.
Idrees, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, the military is a fascinating beat where really, 10 years experience, which is what I have, is not particularly experienced. I mean, we have people like Jamie, we used to have people like Barbara Starr at CNN, Bob Burns at the Associated Press, and David Martin at CBS. We're talking, upwards of 30 years. And it's one of those fascinating beats where stuff is always happening. It's not like diplomacy where, the turn of a phrase is a story. It's either you carried out the bombing that was illegal or it was legal, or, it's in a way very easy to cover, because at its core it's quite simple. And so I think for most journalists, this experience, as tough as it's been, as it's forced us to work much harder. I think it's probably inspired a lot of us to actually continue covering it, because I think the best sort of reaction to the secretary and the administration not wanting us to cover it is to probably cover it harder. So I think we're actually probably working harder as a result of his moves than we were, maybe 6 months ago.
Yeah.
I'm getting a little long in the tooth to consider starting a new beat. But the Pentagon beat, covering the U.S. military, is really one of the best beats in Washington. I would argue it was the best, and that's why I stayed with it for so long. All of the beats in Washington have policy, but the Pentagon has operations too. They actually, deploy troops and move ships, and they fight wars, but they also have a host of social issues, which we're seeing now too. Transgender troops, gays in the military, are women being disadvantaged by the administration? I mean, there's all kinds of social issues, especially culture issues now, that are burning at the Pentagon. And then there's just a whole nother group of, like, science and technology issues about, new kinds of weapons and new kinds of technology that's used on the battlefield, or, airborne lasers, or constellations of satellites. The range of stories that you can do, military medicine, for example, that you can do covering this beat is it's almost unlimited, and the variety is something that can keep you going. And when you get out in the field, like Dan did, and you go and you're with the troops, whether you're on an aircraft carrier or on a submarine or out with troops in infantry, there's nothing more impressive than the soldiers and the sailors and the airmen and even the Space Force now, the Marines. There's nothing more impressive than seeing them in person, especially the younger troops just are able to do things that you just wouldn't think a young person can do. It's so in that sense, it's very gratifying. You're telling that story and you're telling their story. And so it's a great beat. As I said, I'm too old to leave it at this point. And when I leave, I'll be retiring.
So
one
question for all of you before we end. Just very quickly, what worries you the most that the public is, what are you most concerned about with the public not being able to get information? What do we lose if the public cannot be informed about these things? Idrees, how about you?
I think the Pentagon is this amazing thing that it affects the lives of people who are carrying out operations and those being affected by it. And I think less oversight, the more bad things will happen on both sides, right? Like the people carrying it out will suffer, and those at the receiving end. And I think it's a pretty broad answer, but I think just a lack of knowledge is going to, allow things to happen that probably shouldn't have happened. And I think it's true for people who are international who are going to be affected by it, but also those carrying it out. And I think it's a loss for everyone.
Dan, how about you?
I mean, I think there's at least at higher levels of the organization, there's a healthy fear, a fear that's good for democracy, that making a poor decision or putting your career over, your people, your unit, your country, could end up on the front page of a newspaper in a way that's, going to be bad for your career. So maybe you're careful. Like there is a page one quality that I think is in the back of people's minds at times of like, I don't want this stupid decision to end up out in the public, so we should think about it. That is something that comes up. Sometimes referred to as a Washington Post test. I would say that if I were somewhere else, maybe it would be, still the Washington Post edits. But it's a thing that people think about. How do I make sure that I'm not going to do something that ends up in the news and makes me look bad? There's a value to that.
Olivia, when you look at the situation going on, what concerns you that about the information the public might not be getting?
Our military can be viewed in a variety of ways and not necessarily in a positive light. And I do worry that our troops and our soldiers and our sailors are going to assume those negative impacts from not getting those good stories out there. I'm a military brat, and so that's what keeps me going in an environment like this. A smooth sea never made a skilled sailor. And so in these opportune times of perhaps a little bit of turbulence, I find that there are opportunities for resilience. And that's what keeps me going, is the mission and our service members, for sure, and just making sure that they feel valued.
Jamie, I'm gonna, before I turn it back over to Eugene, what worries you about where we are right now?
My biggest worry is the prevalence of misinformation and the demonizing and delegitimizing of the mainstream media, the trusted sources that really work to do accurate contextual reporting. My big fear is that we're heading, we're now in an information ecosystem where people don't know what to believe. It's not even so much that they believe things that are wrong, they just don't know what to believe, because the campaign against the media this constant calling everything fake news, denying stories that are true, are just confusing people who have lives to live. They don't have time to fact check every story. And I think because of that, the prevalence of false beliefs and false narratives is rising, and that doesn't lead to an electorate that can make good, wise decisions. And that's so I will, from failing hands, I will pass my torch to a new generation studying there at the Merrill College at the University of Maryland, and hope they can do better.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. It was wonderful to see all of you, even if it was virtually tonight. Eugene, I'm handing it back over to you.
Lucy, thank you.